Well, good evening, everyone, as we we get together for another KET webinar tonight on the subject of the Royal Norfolks at Kohima. We've got about 110 people, I think, registered to watch tonight, and it's going to be superb. We've got Steve Snelling back with us from Norwich tonight. Steve is a real friend of the Kohima Educational Trust and has given a number of these presentations in the past. One on Lance Corporal John Harmon of the Royal West Kents, and the other on Hill 170. And tonight he's going to spend a little bit of time looking at one of the battalions in the 2nd Division, the Royal Norfolks. In fact, as you will all know, or many will know, it was the home of one of the VC winners, Captain John Randall. It's an extraordinary story, and he's the best man to present it to us. Well, a very warm welcome to everyone from around the world. We've got lots of people dialing in from Australia and America and India, and it's fabulous. And of course, a very warm welcome to everyone who is listening after the event. And it's about time for me to stop jabbering and hand over to Sylvia May. Sylvia.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to another Kohima Educational Trust webinar, and thank you for joining us. Our regular viewers will have noticed that we have stepped up the regularity of these webinars during this important commemorative time. The Battle of Kohima was at its peak 80 years ago, and each week sees another sad anniversary. Next Monday, it'll be 80 years since Jack Randall was killed. So with this in mind, I'm delighted tonight to welcome Steve Snelling, who will tell us about the Royal Norfolk's significant role in this battle. Many of you will have heard Steve speak before. He is a freelance writer from Norwich, England, with a passion for military and local history. Born and raised in Norwich, he has been a writer and journalist all his adult life. He worked with Eastern Counties newspapers as assistant editor, eventually leaving in 2010 to concentrate on his writing. Steve's knowledge of the Royal Norfolk Regiment, who fought at Kohima in 1944, is extensive, and he has an in-depth knowledge of the 2 VCs awarded from actions during the battle. In fact, his previous webinar for KET was on VCs at Kohima, a talk he gave again at the National Army Museum last week. As always, Dr. Robert Lyman will set the scene. Rob has announced the wonderful news, I think I'm allowed to say this, that he is writing a new and definitive account of the Battle of Kohima, which we will look forward to reading hopefully by the end of next year. Please do join in the chat, and if you have any questions, please press the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Rob and Steve will take the questions at the end. Now I'm delighted to hand over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That's very kind. Well, maybe 2026. I've got another project in the way before then, but yes, we do need another big book on Kohima. I'm certain of that. Well, the Royal Norfolks. Well, I'm really looking forward to Steve taking us through his presentation tonight and talking to us about this famous East Anglian battalion. But I really just need to set the scene for everyone so you all understand the role that the Royal Norfolks played in terms of the 2nd Division. Most of you will know that the 2nd Division weren't expecting to fight in Kohima. The 2nd Division had fought through the campaign in 1940 in Europe and had experienced the bitter experience of Dunkirk and had been withdrawn to the UK. And then in late 1942, they were shipped out to India, where they were garrisoned at Pune near Bombay. Their GOC, General Grover, as many of you will know, fought long and hard to try and get an active role in the campaign in 1944, and was eventually asked to take his division all the way across from Pune, 2,000 miles to Calcutta, and thence on to Chittagong. And whilst they were en route, they were diverted to go to Kohima to meet the sudden need in that place. The Japanese had been discovered, were sending a whole division, some 20,000 men across the hills, rather than the brigade, the 3,000 men that Slim had expected. Well, within the 2nd Division, there were 3 brigades, 4, 5, and 6. And the Royal Norfolks were part of the 4th Brigade. And when the plan for taking Kohima from the Japanese, remember the siege began on the 4th, and the Royal West Kents arrived after the siege began on the 5th of April, when General Grover and General Stopford, who is the 33rd Corps commander, looked at Kohima and tried to work out a plan on about the 14th of April, 1944. Grover decided that he was going to fight a 3-brigade battle. 5 brigade on the left-hand side, attacking Kohima village on top of Naga Hill, that very large promontory that many of you will have seen. 6th Brigade would attack up the middle and relieve the defenders of the ridge and remove the tentacles the Japanese were placing around the ridge itself. And 4th Brigade would outflank the entire Pulabadze mountain and come down behind the Japanese on the final ridge that sits to the east of Kohima Aradura Spur, which is where the current Roman Catholic Cathedral is situated. It's quite a dominant piece of geography. So that's the way Grover was going to fight his battle. And the Royal Norfolks were part of 4th Brigade, who were going to undertake the operations on the right flank. And it was a very, very significant operation. Well, that should set the scene. I'm going to now hand over to Steve, and he's going to take us through it step by step. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Well, this talk is based largely on the accounts of 3 men, John Howard, Sammy Horner, and Cliff Butler. They were written shortly after the events they describe, along with interviews I conducted in the 1980s and 1990s to mark the 40th and 50th anniversaries of the Battle of Kohima. Here we are again, though, in the midst of another significant milestone. On this day, 80 years ago, a column of British troops descended into the upper reaches of the Aradura Nala, crossed it by an open glade, and climbed again to a spur above GPT Ridge. The previous day, John Howard, an officer of the 2nd Royal Norfolks, serving as intelligence officer of 4th Brigade, had ascended the same slope to catch a first glimpse of Garrison Hill and Naga Village. From his vantage point, he had seen Jail Hill and the northeastern tip of GPT, but most of what he could see was hidden because of the thick jungle. The battle below, he wrote, was fairly quiet. Our own guns fired now and then, the sound rumbling around the mountains like thunder, but we could see and hear nothing of the enemy. Now, on the afternoon of May the 2nd, 1944, after an exhausting climb that ended as a hands and knees scramble, they could feel the hot sun on their backs. They imagined they had reached their concentration point, Oaks Hill or Yamaguchi's forest, and reported as much to divisional headquarters, who were mystified since patrols had repeatedly reported Oaks Hill to be occupied by the Japanese, which it was. The patrols were right, admitted Howard, and we were wrong. Now, fast forward 20 years to an account written by one who was there. He was the first Royal Norfolk veteran I actually knew. His name was Cliff Butler, and I think this first slide will show you Cliff as I knew him. He was my first newspaper editor, although at the time, this was in the mid-70s, I had no idea of his war service, let alone his involvement in the struggle at Kohima. Anyway, in the 1960s, he'd written an account of his time, and this is something of what he wrote. War, of course, embroils all kinds of men in all kinds of unexpected situations. But if in civilian life one has been a farm worker or a motor mechanic or a newspaper reporter, one surely is bound to feel that one's personal experience has been rather unusual, to say the least, if it happens to have included laboring through untracked country in one of the most outlandish parts of the world, wallowing in day after day of tropical rain, scaling heart-daunting heights thick with jungle, carrying a heavy load on shoulders and back without any hope of a lift, hungering for food and pining for cigarettes, and gazing, the dulled senses momentarily enlivened, into a wild valley glowing with orchids. Add to all these things the fear of the unknown that accompanies every fighting man, the ferocity of a cunning and fanatical enemy, the times of horrible noise and equally horrible silence, the dangerous daylight and the sleepless dark, the killings and the woundings. Put everything together, and some sort of picture is built up of what a man brings to mind when he remembers Kohima. Now, as we said, my subject this evening is the role of the 2nd Royal Norfolks in this battle, and in particular the performance of their remarkable commanding officer. If we could have picture 2, Rob. They were part of the 4th Brigade, as Rob has said, of the 2nd Division, and the 2nd Royal Norfolks was a largely reconstructed battalion following its decimation while acting as rearguard for the British Expeditionary Force, seeking to escape from Dunkirk. Most of the men in the battalion were conscripts or newly commissioned officers. Although ostensibly a regular battalion, they were no longer a regular battalion they were in a regular battalion in only name. Posted out to India shortly after the fall of Singapore, they'd spent almost 2 years on internal security operations and training in the tropics for the anticipated reconquest of Burma. The focus of much of their training was for amphibious operations, intended to strike behind the Japanese lines. Kohima, with its commanding hills laced with positions manned by a well-armed and thoroughly experienced enemy, was not the kind of battle it expected to fight, least of all in what for all of them would be their first, or most of them would be their first encounter with the Japanese. And for the vast majority, it would be their actual baptism of fire. As it turned out, they were singularly fortunate, though it didn't seem so to everyone at the time, in having a commanding officer unusually well suited to the struggle to come. Robert Scott was then in his mid-40s, and if we could have the next picture, Rob. This is him in slightly later life. He was a wounded veteran of the First World War. He'd survived revolution in Ireland and Palestine and came into the Second World War with a boundless enthusiasm and vigor. He was a man and a soldier, I should say, who was well acquainted with the ways of the ordinary soldier. He instinctively knew how to lead, how to inspire, and how to maintain morale. Cliff Butler thought him to be the greatest inspiration, a sometimes fearful but always fearless presence. He was vast in size and character, Cliff Butler wrote, impatient of weaklings and scornful of dodgers. Hard as he could be on his men under his command, he was even tougher on his junior officers, especially those he considered did not measure up to the task. Bert Fitt, a pre-war regular who had his share of run-ins with Scott, yet would live to become one of his greatest admirers, admitted, behind the lines, he was a bugger. We had our ups and downs. Mind you, it wasn't only directed at us. He used to go for the top of the tree. The officers used to shake in their shoes where he was concerned. There was a time in the UK and later in India where there was more than a degree of antipathy between Scott and a number of the battalion's subalterns. His brash, dominating attempts to instill what he regarded as a more martial approach to training fell largely on deaf ears when it came to some of the younger officers, who saw in him a blood-curdling, blimpish character out of touch with modern warfare. The disrespect was mutual. Neither Scott nor the younger officers appreciated each other's virtues, although all of that changed at Kohima. Sammy Horner was one of the younger set, became signals officer at Kohima. He reflected years later, when we weren't in a battle, Robert was a bit of a menace, really. One of Robert Scott's great passions was shooting, and his favorite weapon was a customized .303 rifle with its barrel shortened so that it fired almost like a cannon. He called it Little Willie. For a soldier in command of a battalion largely composed of conscripts, it was a legitimate focus, but to his junior officers, shoots appeared to be a mad obsession. Dickie Davis, whose father had served with Scott during the First World War, said, "If we had 10 yards of ground, we had a shoot." Out in India, Scott, who was commandant for a period of a battle school before being promoted to battalion commander in the summer of 1943, came up with a similarly lethal exercise designed to make every man a first-class marksman. It combined his twin love of golf and shooting. The result was an ingenious firing range sprawling across the sun-scorched Indian plain. Cliff Butler recalled, different sorts of targets were set up as holes, the T's being the various firing points. Obviously, this was a most difficult range to manage from the point of view of safety, the fire crisscrossing it simultaneously from many quarters. One other notable feature of this most remarkable man was that by the time of the Second World War, he had only one eye. The other one had been lost to an injury sustained while serving with the Palestine police in the late 1930s. His elevation to battalion commanding officer was not universally greeted. Indeed, Sammy Horner described the report of his promotion in late June 1943 as the dread news. And for a time after his appointment, life in general became, as Horner put it in his diary, very strained, with an undercurrent of discontent. But there was rather more to Robert Scott than met the eye. To his second in command, Henry Conder, and we've got the next picture, Rob. This is Henry Conder, his second in command, who later commanded a battalion in Burma in the King's Own Scottish Borderers. He described Scott as an Elizabethan born out of his time. He was very well read, he said. He carried a pocket Shakespeare in his top pocket, very fond of poetry, yet you wouldn't have thought it. He was also a hard drinking, hard swearing, an amazing mixture, but a first-class leader who led from the front, which you had to do in the kind of terrain where we were fighting, and you could only see a short distance in front of you. One of his men reckoned he would have dealt with the Spanish Armada on his own. A big, bluff character, larger than life in every respect, he was, in the words of another veteran and future chronicler of the battle, one of the few men to whom great violence and danger were natural elements. He trod the battlefield like a great actor treads the stage. If we can move on to the next picture, Rob. These are some of the junior officers that Robert Scott had his problems with at various times. You've got Sammy Horner, second left, Jack Randall, third left, and John Howard is second from the right. Now, having cleared the initial roadblocks between Dimapur and Kohima, General Grover, commanding 2nd Division, fed some troops into the embattled position and charged 2 battalions of 4th Brigade, led by Scott's Royal Norfolks, with the hazardous and arduous task of delivering a right hook round the Japanese flank to take them in the rear, or, as Scott put it, shoot them up the arse. Operation Strident, as it was officially styled, represented either a bold or foolhardy approach to a battle, at which even the local district commissioner initially balked. Grove's idea was for the column to cut a path through hill country dominated by a 7,500-foot peak, slashed by precipitous gullies, all of which were smothered in dense jungle, to reach the Aradura Spur south of Kohima and cut the Imphal Road by establishing a block across the Japanese line of communications. In other words, to do to the Japanese what they had so often done to the British, in the vain hope, as it turned out, that it would force a precipitate withdrawal. Its main advantage was that few would have imagined anyone in their right mind would contemplate such a feat. For hard as it was in normal circumstances to do so, with the prospect of an impending monsoon, it was to court disaster. Such then was the backdrop to what the Norfolks dubbed the Great Trek. It lasted 7 days and was a relentlessly exhausting slog from beginning to end. And we've got some pictures here. I think if we go through the next one, this one shows, this is not during the trek or anything, but it shows General Grover there, second from the left. And in the background, we have General Stopford. Then if we move on to the next one, this one shows the 4 Brigade headquarters and it shows Brigadier Willie Goshen in the middle of the rear row, next to the very tall man. General Grover, that's right, and General Grover is third from the left, standing, and in the front is the intelligence officer who we are using much of, and that's John Howard in the middle there. And if we go to the next picture, here we have Sammy Horner, who we'll come on to very shortly. Let me just find the point. Yeah, while the focus here is actually on the Royal Norfolks, it's important to state that they were not alone. The trek was undertaken by a skeleton brigade headquarters of 4th Brigade, 1st Battalion Royal Scots, 2nd Battalion Royal Norfolks, 143 Special Service Company, a section of Royal Engineers, a platoon of 2nd Manchesters, who are machine gunners, an assortment of ancillary units, including Royal Artillery, Royal Army Medical Corps, and Royal Army Service Corps. The outflanking move was expected to last 4 days, but it hinged almost entirely, really, on the loyalty of the local Nagas. Local intelligence officers expressed their confidence in the Nagas, who they considered to be 100% loyal to the Allied cause, and an opinion treated by 4 Brigade staff with mistaken reserve. But their faith was to prove entirely justified. And but for their tireless support as porters and guides, the manoeuvre would have been doomed to failure. Accounts vary as to the number of Nagas engaged in the operation. Howard says 300, Horner 200. Either way, their extraordinary effort was critical to its success. One officer of the Royal Norfolks hailed his battalion's achievement in completing the march, stating that it was testament to the unit's supreme fitness. That was itself a product of the grueling Indian training program, and yet their fitness was as nothing compared to the Nagas, who did most of the heavy lifting. Describing the start of the trek, Sammy Horner said, "It was decided to move at a normal speed with frequent halts, but this didn't fit in the Naga plan of things, and they soon got tired of stopping so often. They liked to go on for a long time and then have a long rest, and eventually they were allowed to proceed at their own speed. The speed at which they moved seemed amazing, always singing, or rather grunting. They carried the heavy load, anything up to 100 pounds, slung on their backs, supported by a single jungle twine rope with a wide leather strap for putting across the forehead. The march itself was delayed by hunger and tiredness. For the final section of the trek, they were reduced to half light rations. They were expecting limited supplies and further supplies by airdrop once they reached Kohima. The Naga porters, however, were relentless. Horner again. Each day the Nagas set off at top speed and left the column trudging along slowly but surely. At midday they would pass on their way back for a second load. It was a case of up one steep khud and down the other side, then up a steeper one and down again. Parties of Naga porters were interspersed in the column, and they were quite unable to understand why the troops were out of breath when they reached the top of a hill. The heat, the humidity, the altitude, and the slope of almost every foot of ground combined to knock hell out of the stoutest constitution. Men gasped for air, which didn't seem to come. They dragged their legs upwards till they seemed reduced by the strength of wobbly matchsticks, hearts pounding so violently it seemed as they might burst, drumming so loudly as to be heard above the sweating and cursing. Urged and prodded ever on, only to discover the top of the hill was in fact a false crest with a path winding further upwards. And then once at the top, there was the realization that they faced a hellish climb down. As Horner said, "You forgot the Jap, you forgot time, you forgot hunger and thirst. All you can think of is the next halt." After 3 days, the column, a massive great chain about a quarter of a mile long, rested up in a dark jungly cleft filled with towering trees covered in dripping moss that was soon dubbed Death Valley. Bert May of Headquarters Company remembered it as a stinking hell of a hole. All the vegetation on the ground was dead. It stank to high heaven. Worse still, it was infested with mosquitoes and leeches. It was a march into the unknown that was hardly guaranteed to calm tempers. Indeed, the trek was punctuated by disputes between Scott and Grover over the headwear, helmets or bush hats, Scott advocating the latter, lost to his great good fortune, and Scott and his brigade commander, Willie Goshen, over fires being lit to boil water for tea, which he eventually won, to the men's great satisfaction. If we can move on with pictures, Rob. This plan gives an idea. The orange line shows the route they took, which starts from the Iron Bridge in the top left corner on April 25th, and they followed down and continues through the red dotted line to Kohima and on and down round past Pullabadzi and up towards the position. If we get to the position around about 1st of May, that's where they were then. And I just have one thing to include here. Yeah, it was while resting in Death Valley that the Norfolks learned of a change of plan. Instead of aiming for Arradura Spur and a blocking role, they were to make for the enemy's flank much closer to the besieged garrison and to launch an attack on the Japanese-held GPT Ridge, coming down on them from above. John Howard believed the change of plan was influenced by the likelihood of the Japanese reaction. Occupying Arradura Spur, he thought, might not have forced them to leave their positions close to Kohima. 5 brigades advanced from the north had already resulted in a stalemate of sorts, while Arradura Spur would be difficult to establish a line of communication beyond their own jungle path. An attack on GPT, on the other hand, would, said Howard, penetrate into the heart of the Jap positions dominating Garrison Hill, and we could fairly easily make contact with the troops in Jotsoma and the Punjab Ridge areas, or so he thought, while an armoured column from Garrison Hill could also lend support to operations along the main road. Later, he would wonder if it had been the right decision, but concluded, judging by Sato's bullet-headed perseverance in maintaining his object of capturing Kohima at all costs, I am rather of the opinion that had we moved to Arradura, there would have been another stalemate. The Battle of Kohima would still have been won, but whether quicker or slower, or with fewer casualties, no one can now tell. He observed, though, of their situation as they approached GPT Ridge, never did we launch an attack on so little intelligence, though it must be remembered that we deliberately refrained from patrolling to gain information in order that we might gain surprise. If we move on here to the next one, this gives you an idea of the terrain. You can see at the top there, Norfolk Ridge, looking down on GPT, and so you've got a sort of sense of where they're coming from and the kind of terrain that they're facing. And then one more picture, I think, which we have, which shows you GPT is up top left-hand corner. This is taken later, but it's again gives you an idea of roughly the ground, some of the ground. The final approach was largely unobserved, and by the afternoon they were in position. The next day, final preparations were made, including a recce patrol personally led by Goshen, that achieved nothing beyond deluding themselves into thinking they were 500 yards from the edge of the jungle from where they proposed to attack, when in fact they were closer to 1,200 yards away. Not only that, they had no idea of the strength of the enemy or their precise location. Then if we go on to the next picture, Rob, this gives you the plan, roughly a plan of the, again, you can see the position of GPT at the bottom. Garrison Hill is some distance to the top. And you can see the various hills. Got Jail Hill, which was a significant hill in between as well. Just before dawn on May the 4th, the leading platoon headed off. spearheading the battalion's advance through a thick tangle of trees, bamboo, and bushes towards the start line, where it was planned for them to halt and wait for a 45-minute artillery bombardment to plaster the ridge before launching their attack. However, plans rarely survive contact with the enemy, and this one was no exception, albeit more dramatically so than most. Forced by the nature of the terrain to advance on a two-section front with the rest of the unit following in single file, they quickly had the unwelcome distraction of having to overcome a stoutly defended enemy bunker and a myriad of snipers. And this was even before they were anywhere near the start line. Henry Condor, the second in command, called it a series of one-man fronts, tremendously unpleasant, slipping and slithering under fire from a mostly unseen enemy. As Sammy Horner commented, it was now only too obvious that the enemy was not only expecting our attack, but strongly disapproved of it. For many of the men untested in combat, it was an unnerving experience. George Bartram, B Company Commander's Batman, recalled going to ground as bullets hit the floor a foot in front of his head. A lot of the men were going down, he said. It was so confusing. Men were getting shot down and you couldn't see where it was coming from. They were so close. Every shot was a man. Trained to preserve ammunition by only shooting at clear targets, the Norfolks offered little by way of return fire. They were in a quandary about what to do. We have an official record which stated, "The leading company, accompanied by Colonel Scott, after bypassing the first Jap position, came under heavy light machine gun and sniper fire on a narrow jungle path. Many were hit, and the remainder seemed momentarily dazed. Colonel Scott got up and walked slowly forward, cheering and encouraging his men to shoot back. His actual words, bellowed in all directions, were, 'Start blasting them and advance. Shoot up in the trees, get shooting.' With that," Sammy Horner said, "we went on." Amid a thunderous racket, the pace quickened. Soon they were nearing the edge of the jungle. Horner wrote, "The trees began to thin and we could see bits of Kohima in front of us. This was where they were supposed to pause for the artillery barrage before attacking the enemy on GPT. In reality, as Horner recalled, there was no break in the advance." Horner said, "Robert Scott quite rightly decided not to wait for it. We had got a momentum going. There was no point in stopping, so we just went on." At that stage, Scott was up front with the leading elements, partly, as Horner said, in order to better direct the attack, and partly because it was in his nature to be there. It was bloody ridiculous, thought John Howard, but inspiring all at once. He presented a terrifying sight, brandishing a newly captured Japanese sword and firing his revolver at anything that got in his way. His foghorn voice, roaring encouragement and hurling abuse in equal measure, could be heard above the sound of battle, and was quickly taken up by others until it was with a loud cheer that the Norfolks charged. Bren guns blazing, bayonets fixed, across the open, exposed ridge. In the course of their advance, a platoon led by Colour Sergeant Bert Fitt, a pre-war regular from Marham, overran a small mountain gun that would eventually find its way by somewhat devious means back to the UK for display. And if we go to the next picture, Rob, this is Bert Fitt in pre-war days in India. And the next picture, this is the mountain gun they overran and which found its way back to the UK and the Regimental Museum. By mid-afternoon, the crest of GPT, with its view down to the Imphal Road 500 yards below, was in Norfolk hands, and all without the assistance of an artillery barrage. The consequent wireless conversation would go down in regimental folklore. Scott to Goshen, "I am on GPT and am consolidating. Casualties pretty heavy, but we've killed a hell of a lot of Japs." Goshen to Scott, "But you can't be on GPT, you haven't had the fire plan yet." "I am, I tell you. You'd better send someone up to see." The capture of GPT Ridge, marked not so much the end of a struggle, but merely the big end of the beginning of the Norfolk's prolonged ordeal at Kohima. In the hours and days that followed, it became clear that the victory, remarkable though it was, would not be sufficient to bounce the Japanese into a full-scale retreat. Instead, the fighting that followed would, as John Howard noted, develop into a close-range slogging match that was fought often in torrential rain on ground approaching a quagmire, which Grover considered worse than anything he'd experienced on the Somme. Indeed, the Norfolk's long agony began even before the first day was over. Elements of B Company, including its commander, Russell Twidle, overshot the crest and were caught in a vortex of fire from a range of neighbouring positions, burrowed into the adjoining spurs. Twidle was among a number of men seriously wounded and trapped in the open, beyond immediate rescue by the threat of sniper and close-range machine gun fire. And if we show the next picture, Rob, that's Russell Twidle on the left, seriously injured at Kohima, very fortunate to survive. Dennis Hatch, who had the military cross from the previous from 1940 campaign, killed at Kohima, and Bill Murray Brown, who went on to command the battalion later in the Burma campaign. Following the capture of GPT, Japanese snipers presented the greatest menace. One of the first victims was Charlie Barkley. And if we go to the next picture, this is the Charlie Barkley, and the next one as well, Rob. And then we'll stop at the next one. Yeah. He was a young subaltern, had been serving with the 9th Sussex, and managed to wangle a transfer to the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Norfolks, in late 1943. On May the 5th, after the capture of GPT, he'd gone across to talk to Jack Randall, and in the midst of their conversation, a shot rang out which narrowly missed Randall and struck Charlie Barkley. As he fell, another bullet hit him and detonated a grenade he was carrying, and he was killed instantly. Scott later wrote to his parents, and he explained the situation at the time. It's one of the there aren't many accounts from Scott himself, and this is one that gives some idea of how he felt things were going. He said, "We'd consolidated, but were by no means well placed, as the Jap could and did snipe from 3 sides, and I could not get more men to clean him out. C Company held the east side of the box, touching on A on their right. They had dug in well, and there was no chance of a counter-attack then succeeding, though any movement above ground brought fire at once, and the Japanese sniping was accurate. From the other west side, there was every chance of trouble, as the jungle was thick, and the Royal Scots nearly 300 foot up the ridge, and I could not risk thinning out my box to clear it. The Japanese had 2 good snipers hidden up, which made it impossible to move above ground in many places, and they cost the regiment many grand chaps, including Charles." The Norfolk's hold on GPT was precarious at this stage. It was discovered that a Japanese position of unknown strength barred the way down to the road, thus preventing both ammunition reaching them and casualties being evacuated. Something would have to be done about that, what would become known as Norfolk Bunker, but it was quickly apparent that clearing it would be no easy proposition. A first attack by the carrier platoon was repulsed, so it was decided to mount a larger attack with the remains of Russell Twidle's company, now led by his second in command, Jack Randall. Randall was hardly a model officer. A law graduate from Oxford, where one of his closest friends was Leonard Cheshire, the future bomber ace and Victoria Cross recipient, he was married with a young son who had been born after he departed England, and whose brother-in-law had died 2 years earlier in a desperate act of self-sacrifice which had earned him a posthumous award of the VC. A heavy sleeper with a rare capacity for consuming huge quantities of beer, he'd been known to go on parade with his pajamas visible beneath his uniform. His drinking misadventures had already cost him one command, and he had had more than one run-in with Robert Scott. Even so, he possessed a quiet determination. As his friends later remarked, he was the kind of man who, once handed a task, would see it through to the bitter end, which was precisely what he did in the misty, rain-swept dawn of May the 6th on Norfolk Bunker. And if we go to the next picture, Rob, this is Jack Randall relaxing, and next one after that shows him, this is a picture when he was displaying his bush hat, which had been presented to them in 1943 with the Britannia badge on the front, which they put on, and this was one that was sent home to his wife. As they pushed forward on that morning, they sustained heavy casualties, and with his attack in danger of stalling, he ordered Colour Sergeant Fitt to lead an assault on one log-covered machine gun post while he charged the other single-handedly, with nothing but a bayonet-tipped rifle and grenade and his own courage to sustain him. The result was inevitable but also extraordinary. Fitt, who had just subdued his post, looked on in awe as Randall was caught in full stride by a burst of machine gun fire. Fitt said he was hit in the upper half of his body, but it didn't stop him. I called out to him, "Go down," but he kept on. He just made it to the position, and as he threw his grenade, he threw his body forward and sealed the slit. It was a quite deliberate act to block the opening of the bunker to save the remainder of the company. Nobody could credit the bravery of that man. And if we go on to the next pictures, this is some of the men who took part in that attack, with Bert Fitt arrowed and the third from the right at the bottom. Yeah, the result of this battle, as you can see, there's a painting of the action. This was commissioned by the regiment in the 1950s by one of the officers of the regiment. It shows Randall in the act of throwing his grenade into the slit, and Bert Fitt is shown running across the top there. Yeah, too late to affect the situation for Randall, unfortunately. Then the next two pictures, is one of my first introductions to Captain Randall as a child, story of his actions as presented in the Victor comic. As I say, the result of this action was a posthumous VC, but contrary to some accounts, it did not ensure the capture of the position. Though at least 3 bunkers were overcome, more existed, and Scott considered the remnants of B Company too weak to hold the ground they had won at such heavy cost. The following day, they were pulled back, along with men from another platoon sent forward in support. Norfolk Bunker remained a thorn in the side of 2nd Division's efforts to clear the Japs out of the neighbouring hills until it was finally cleared by a combined tank and infantry assault over the course of 2 days in the middle of May. Following the capture of Norfolk Bunker and during the clean-up period prior to the fight for Aradura Spur, there was what Sammy Horner called an interesting discovery. Some regimental collar badges were found on a Japanese body. Horner later wrote, as the battalion was carrying no means of identification, it was clear that these badges must have come from Singapore, and all ranks were able to feel that the battalion had already a modicum of revenge on some of the actual Japs who had fought against the 4th, 5th and 6th battalions, all of whom had gone into the bag in Singapore. One of these badges was later mounted and presented to the Regimental Museum. And the next picture, after the picture of Jack Randall's grave, if we go to the next one, we have that badge, which was picked up from Norfolk Bunker from one of the Japanese, which is a kind of extraordinary story, really. Now, by now, the deadly slogging match that John Howard had spoken of had cost the lives of successive commanders of 4 Brigade, as well as an increasing number of the 2nd Royal Norfolks. Conditions on what had now become Norfolk Ridge were appalling. Life, as Cliff Butler put it, was universally grim. He later wrote, snipers creeping close up to the perimeter were persistently troublesome, and almost every incautious movement attracted a shot. Stretcher bearers had a hectic job, often going out under fire to bring in casualties. At odd intervals from the neighbouring ridge of Aradura, upon which it was believed the bulk of the Japs in the area had concentrated, came mortar fire and shells. For several days, until communication had been established with the road, the problem of supply was a serious one. Men were short of food, a cigarette was a rare luxury, and sometimes tea was brewed from water ladled out of flooded trenches. The traditionally scrupulous Royal Norfolk Regiment were unwashed and bearded. That went for the commanding officer too, who remained a tower of strength and a talisman, whose presence did more than anything to maintain morale amid such adversity. John Howard, who came to see him frequently, especially during his spells as acting brigadier, wrote of him, 2 minutes with him and a man's fears were calmed, and the mud and wet did not matter so much. His boots covered in mud made his large feet even larger. His trousers were covered in dried blood. Grenades and a pistol and a dagger hung around his vast waistline. His neck was muffled in a silk Japanese flag, on which rested a stubby chin of greying black beard. His head was bandaged, and his tin hat boasted a ragged bullet hole. He had lumbago and leaned on a long stick. He had a headache and a vile temper. I doubt if he'd ever enjoyed himself more in his 40-odd years. He also said Robert's great powers of leadership lay to a great extent in the fact that he hardly changed at all from peace to war. He shouted angrily and obscenely as before. He thought and moved slowly as usual. He lit his pipe with the same care as always. In the midst of chaos and mud, with friends being killed, this one staple feature remained. His oddness and shortcomings, which had been abnormal before, were still untouched by war. One thing, however, had changed: his opinion of his junior officers. He had thought them useless before, but none failed him in battle, and many lost their lives most gallantly. He was still as rude to those that had survived, but there was a trust and an affection in his voice which had not been there before. He was, as we had expected, absurdly brave, and inspired the same quixotic gallantry among many around him. His rumbling shout, "Take cover, you silly buggers, we're being shelled, everybody down except me, I've got lumbago, they can't get me," had cheered many quaking hearts and brought a smile to many trembling lips. Oh dear, with a smile and a twinkle in his one good eye, we are all going to be killed, made the possibilities of death more remote. If we can go to the next picture, Rob. This is showing again the terrain later. It's sort of looking toward Jail Hill. And again, you've got the sort of the ground there, but this was taken on May the 8th. I think we came to that conclusion. Yeah, May the 8th, 1944. And if we go to the next picture. Here we have, or the one before, I think, is, or the one after that. Sorry, Rob. Yeah. That shows you the evacuation of casualties along the road later on. Yeah, and then if we go to the next picture, and here we have the cartoon that we had at the start. This was done by one of the officers in the battalion, did a series of cartoons of the officers, and this one is of Robert Scott. Later, as Rob pointed out to me, actually, he's at the time, he's a brigadier here. And you can see something of his girth and profile. Now we come to the final period, really, for the Norfolks at Kohima, for what Cliff Butler described as 3 cold, rain-sodden weeks on the ridge. Scott had seemed as indestructible as he was indomitable, but finally, even his luck ran out. Hill by hill, the Japanese had been prized away from the once fragile perimeter around Kohima. Then, in the closing days of May, the Norfolks were given the task of dislodging them from one of their last strongholds, on Charles Hill, part of the Aradura spur that had been their initial objective. The assault by exhausted men up a sheer 4,000-foot high slope in the face of tenacious resistance was doomed to failure. A newsletter entry by an officer at the time said the enemy had it covered in enfilade and defilade and every other form of lade. Cliff Butler added, near the summit, C Company in the morning and B Company in the afternoon met with a hail of fire and showers of grenades lobbed down onto them. Further advance was impossible, and before dark, the battalion was ordered back to its original position. Not even the heroic example of Robert Scott leading from the front as ever could conjure a victory. One of his subalterns, Maurice Francis of B Company, later recalled him giving personal support to his embattled platoon with a seemingly endless supply of grenades, which he delivered in the style of a medium spin bowler, standing his ground and pausing only to kick away the odd Japanese grenade if it came closer to him than a foot or so. Sadly, wrote Francis, he took his eye off the ball once too often and was felled. While the rest of us tried to follow his example, our stretcher bearers' efforts to carry him away were rewarded by obscenities previously unheard in these parts. By returning his compliments and by sheer weight of numbers, they eventually got him to relative safety. Scott's part in the fighting was over, and so too, virtually, was that of his battalion. According to Francis, that day's fighting had added 50 more casualties to the already long list, reducing the unit's strength to around 400 all ranks, well below half the number that had left India only a few weeks earlier. The attritional struggle was almost over. 2 days after the Norfolk's last forlorn effort, the Japanese ordered a general withdrawal. Fierce fighting continued as a defiant enemy rearguard battled bravely, often to the bitter end, to hold off the advancing British and Indian troops. But the game was up. Finally, on June 22nd, a force of tanks coming down from Kohima met elements of 5th Indian Division advancing north from Imphal. The great siege was over. The Japanese threat to India had been thoroughly vanquished. The tide of war had turned forever. So near to victory, the Japanese had suffered a crushing defeat at Kohima. Of the nearly 20,000 men sent into battle, there were fewer than 3,000 that lived to recross the River Chindwin 3 months later. If we go to the next picture, Rob. The following autumn, Cliff Butler was among the men of the Royal Norfolks who attended the unveiling of a memorial in a roadside clearing overlooking Kohima, in sight of the wooded slopes on which the men whose memory it perpetuates. He wrote at the time, dead stumps of trees blasted in the fighting stood out among the greenery of the ridges, and were the only visible signs that war had passed this way. Behind us loomed the hills which were 2 of our bitterest battlegrounds. Last post and reveille sounded across the hills, and before leaving, Cliff turned to take a last look. In the sombre green background, he wrote, the wild marigolds behind the cross were a splash of golden colour, and I thought what a homely symbol they seemed. Robert Scott would later look back on the capture and consolidation of GPT Ridge as not only his own greatest achievement, but that of the battalion. He later wrote, the regiment has never done anything finer, and noted that the corps commander had renamed GPT Norfolk Ridge in its honour. Of his own conduct, there was no disputing its galvanising influence on the outcome of the battle. Over the years, his exploits have acquired near legendary status within the regiment, and there were many at the time who considered his actions worthy of the highest award, not least Major General Grover, who personally recommended he be awarded the Victoria Cross, even before he was wounded performing further desperate feats of gallantry on Aradura Spur. In a note appended to the accompanying citation, Grover stated that prior to being killed, Brigadier Goshen had told him that the success of the advance onto the vital high ground of GPT was mainly due to the magnificent and fearless leadership of Colonel Scott. Grover himself observed that his splendid example was a major factor in the ultimate success of the whole division's operations. He also drew attention to the battalion's very difficult approach march and the spirit which Scott had imbued in the battalion, so that under his leadership they were prepared to take on any task, however tough. But it was not enough. the recommendation was downgraded to do it to a DSO by Bill Slim, no less. And I'd just like to finish with some pictures which carry on the story. This is the regimental memorial at Kohima, and we go on to the next one, and we'll see two of the officers there on the left, Maurice Francis and Sammy Horner, during a return trip to the memorial in 1994 for the 50th anniversary. And we go on, and we see the changing face of the background, if you like, the backdrop at Kohima. And the next one, yep, and go on to the final. I think that yep, and it shows it's more and more built up. And here we have in Kohima War Cemetery the lines of the Royal Norfolks, those who didn't go home. And I just wanted to end with this picture, which I just rather like. It's the late great Bert Fitt, who later on became a regimental sergeant major of the Royal Norfolks, and this shows him in the 1990s at Britannia Barracks, which is the home of the Royal Norfolk Regiment, and showing him with his medal group, his Kohima DCM, there at the group. And that's the end of that story. So that was the Royal Norfolks at Kohima.
Oh, that was fantastic, Steve. Thank you very, very much. And the photographs you've sourced were, I thought, completely brilliant, even though I've seen them in books. But,
yeah,
you know,
yes,
really, really good to see them all brought together like that. And your telling, for me, also brings home the fierceness of the battle and how the leaders led from the front. You know, and the Norfolks, isn't it right? They lost 2 brigadiers in the space of a week,
they did,
which is unusual.
Absolutely, and they were both very close to Robert Scott when they were killed. I think that there was a great irony in the fact that Robert Scott was probably one of the biggest men on that ridge, and he seemed to somehow escape by some miracle, only to be seriously wounded on Aradura Spur. Yeah, he was incredibly fortunate.
Rob, do you want to add anything? Are there any questions you want to take, or shall we wrap up?
Let's wrap up. I don't think there are any specific questions that people have got, but just as a normal reminder, if you've got anything for Steve or indeed for any of us, then send us an email and we'll respond appropriately. I've just had a quick look through the chats.
Absolutely.
I don't think there's anything specific.
Well, okay, yeah, we'll do that. And just to say, for those who were not with us last week, KET, together with the National Army Museum, had a brilliant weekend. And I'm now got a frog in my throat. With a series of talks bringing together over 1,000 people over the course of the weekend. Rob reprieved his brilliant Greatest Battle talk, which we are planning to get up on our website for all to view very soon. In fact, the next webinar will be one of those talks which Rob and Michael Shipster hosted, along with a film of Fergal Keane talking about the siege. We will be screening that on Thursday, the 30th of May. Meanwhile, we've now added all of our new lines to our shop, which also have just 2 copies left of Hannah Watson's Jungle War, a wonderful fictionalised account of the Gurkhas in the Burma campaign, sold in support of the Gurkha Welfare Trust and the museum. I haven't put this on the online shop, but if you would like a copy, please just email me. As I said, I've only 2 copies left, and one of them is signed by the author. And also a reminder to those of you who have yet to book a place at the York Kohima service on 4th of July. There are still some places left, and it is always wonderful. It's a wonderful occasion which brings together this KET family of friends and families of veterans. Like at NAM last week, new friends are also always made. I will leave you with the photograph that I also shared last week, where wreaths laid at the memorial in the Kohima War Cemetery on the 4th of April 1944. My father, Gordon Graham, once said that memory is not enough. It is what we do with it that matters. And that is when KET was born. Thank you for joining us tonight, and look forward to seeing you on 30th of May. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.